They couldn't even spell my name right on the termination notice. After 17 years, it just said Sullivan M. Not Mark. Not the man who had architected half their data infrastructure, who had single-handedly recovered their systems from the server crash of 2013, and who wrote the very onboarding manual they still handed to new hires. Just Mark Sullivan. A typo. A single careless keystroke that told me everything I needed to know about my value to them now. Greg slid the folder across the polished desk as if he were passing me a restaurant menu. He didn't make eye contact. Next to him, Sarah from HR sat rigidly in her chair, her smile a little too practiced, her gaze a little too rehearsed. A third person, probably from the legal department, sat silently in the corner. I didn't bother asking. "We're restructuring," Greg said, the words sounding stale and pre-chewed. "It's a strategic pivot. Your position has been reevaluated as no longer aligned with our future direction." Misalignment. That was the new corporate jargon for it. I gave a single slow nod. Just once. I didn't blink. I didn't say a word. I reached for the folder, closed it after reading only the header, and slipped it into the worn laptop bag I'd carried since 2019. No questions, no protests. I stood up slowly, as if I had all the time in the world, and adjusted the strap on my shoulder. Greg finally looked up. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had clearly expected shouting, or tears, or maybe even begging. He didn't know me at all. Outside his office, the air in the building felt heavier. Or perhaps I was just now feeling the weight of being erased. The office floor was far too quiet for 9 in the morning. The cubicles hummed with the soft glow of monitors and the muffled tapping of keyboards. No one dared to meet my eyes as I walked by. A few people glanced up, then quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in non-existent emails. I didn't hold it against them. I'd trained half of them myself, showing them how to query the old SQL servers when the cloud services failed. I'd sat with them during coffee breaks and shared photos of my daughter's graduation in the break room. Now I was radioactive. I reached my desk on the 4th floor, in the northeast corner by the window with the leaky seal. On clear days, you could see the Denver skyline. On humid days, it was just fog and condensation. My chair let out its familiar creak. The N key on my keyboard was still faded from the time I'd spilled coffee and tried to clean it with an old toothbrush. The small cactus on my shelf seemed to be leaning a little more to the left. I touched its soil. Bone dry. I only had 3 personal items to pack. The first was a framed photo of Emily, my daughter, on her 10th birthday, proudly holding a science fair trophy that was nearly as big as she was. The second was a ceramic mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad." Its handle was cracked, but, like me, it was still hanging on. The last item was a small brass compass, a real one, not just for decoration. It had belonged to my grandfather, a Navy engineer who used to say, "When you can't trust the map, follow true north." I placed each item gently into my bag. The silence around me was deafening. It said everything that needed to be said. Jessica from marketing appeared at the edge of my cubicle, her lipstick slightly smudged, as if she'd applied it in a hurry. "Mark, I just heard," she whispered. "They're really doing this." I nodded. "This is insane," she said, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "You practically built this department." "It's not about building anymore," I said quietly. "It's about replacing." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say more, but she stopped herself. She gave my shoulder a brief, sympathetic touch, and then walked away. I paused for a moment before standing up. Across the room, I could see Greg watching me. He wasn't even trying to be discreet, just standing outside his office, with his arms crossed like a security guard, pretending this was all routine. I walked right past him without a glance. His face was a blank slate. No victory, no regret, just emptiness. It was as if he'd already filed me away in a folder labeled past. Down at the reception desk, Maria looked up as I handed her my security badge. Her eyes showed a flicker of confusion. "Effective immediately?" she asked. "Apparently," I replied. She hesitated for a moment before dropping the plastic card into a drawer. "You were always a decent man, Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Some of the people upstairs, they forget things fast." I gave her a small nod and stepped out into the overcast Denver sky, which hung low and indifferent. A breeze swept through the parking lot, carrying the scent of fresh mulch from the landscaping crew that was always late. I walked to my car slowly, like someone leaving a funeral. I sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. Through the windshield, I looked up at the 12 stories of brushed glass that housed Apex Innovations, a world of artificial light and an endless stream of support tickets. I had started here when the company occupied just 2.5 floors in a shared tech park near Aurora. Back then, we were struggling just to keep the lights on, literally. The servers overheated every week, and payroll was managed on an Excel spreadsheet. My first desk was crammed between a broken printer and a stack of unused routers. On my first day, I stayed until midnight because someone had forgotten to test the off-site backup system, and the entire billing database crashed during a major client pitch. I fixed it. No one had asked me to. I just knew how. For 17 years, that's what I did. I just knew how. And now I was simply gone. I reached over and opened the glove compartment. Inside, nestled among old receipts, was a small black USB drive on a keyring. It looked ordinary, but I'd always called it my insurance policy. Company policy technically forbade taking any data off-site. But years ago, after a phishing attack exposed sensitive client information, the legal team had asked me to create an early warning protocol. It involved forensics, detailed logging, and secure backups. I explained that to do it right, I would need to maintain mirrored data off the network for true auditing capabilities. They agreed, signed the waiver, and then promptly forgot all about it. But I didn't. I had kept everything: meeting recordings, administrator logs, change histories, access records, and emails that were never meant to see the light of day. While they were patting themselves on the back for going agile, I was quietly noticing who was disabling audit trails and who was secretly modifying approval flows. I had seen enough to know that something rotten had started to grow inside Apex. So I started digging. Not for revenge, not back then. It was just curiosity. And now, they had let me go. Without revoking half of my old credentials, without collecting my devices, without even checking to see what I might have noticed, they had no idea what they had just unleashed. I stared back at the building, gleaming with a false sense of pride in the morning light. To them, I was just a laid-off data analyst, disposable, replaceable. But they had just fired the man who built the vault and still held the only spare key. I started the car. Wednesday was going to be interesting. Most people in that building thought I was just quiet. Not shy or awkward, just There. The guy who fixed problems before anyone else knew they existed. The man who only spoke when something was broken, and even then, it was usually just to say that it was already handled. They weren't entirely wrong. I had always let my work speak for itself. The problem was that somewhere along the line, people had stopped listening. That's the thing about quiet men. They become invisible. And invisible men see everything. I drove home with the windows down, the October wind brushing against my temples, carrying away the last remnants of a loyalty I hadn't yet admitted was long gone. Our house was near the end of a cul-de-sac in Boulder, tucked behind a row of stubborn pine trees that had withstood every storm for the last 30 years. The same couldn't be said for me. Laura's car was already in the driveway. She was a teacher and always got home by 3:30, unless it was a parent-teacher conference week. I checked the clock. 3:47. She would know something was wrong. The garage door opened with the same tired hum it had made for 15 years. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat in the silence for a moment, letting the radio whisper to an empty car. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. Laura was at the kitchen island, grading papers with one hand and sipping tea with the other. She looked up, and I must have had it written all over my face. She didn't ask. She just set her pen down, quietly poured another cup of tea, and pushed it toward me. I took it. Bad? She asked softly. I nodded. How bad? Gone. She didn't flinch. She just let the word hang in the air between us like steam rising from the mug. She had been with me through everything. Through the dot-com bust that we somehow managed to survive. Through all the years I came home late smelling of server room dust. She understood the weight of that single word better than anyone. I sat down across from her. They didn't even look me in the eye, Laura. She reached across the island and took my hand. Her fingers were warm and strong. You were the best thing that ever happened to that place, she said. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't believe her, but because a part of me had started to wonder if being the best thing mattered to anyone but her. That night I couldn't sleep. I got up around 2 a.m. and walked barefoot across the cool kitchen tiles to the small home office tucked away behind the laundry room. I switched on the desk lamp, casting just enough light to see without waking the rest of the house. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, behind old tax returns and Emily's school awards, was a metal lockbox. I entered the combination from muscle memory. Inside were 3 USB drives, labeled not with names, but with a color-coding system only I understood. I plugged the first one in. The system came to life quietly, like a dog recognizing its master. I hadn't touched these files in over a year, not because they weren't important, but because I hadn't wanted to believe I would ever need them. Now everything was different. I clicked open a folder labeled Project Nightingale. It was something I had started 2 years ago after noticing a strange pattern of administrative changes. They were subtle and spread out over time. A deleted access log here, a change in an invoice approval chain there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Corporate systems are always messy. But the more I dug, the less random it seemed. Then, about 18 months ago, Greg had insisted on streamlining security roles. Too many legacy accounts, he'd said. Too many redundancies. He meant me. That same month, I was quietly removed from the procurement routing list. My access wasn't deactivated. I was just taken off email threads I had been on for years. Vendor renewals, infrastructure orders, license extensions. Suddenly, I was out of the loop. They claimed it was a permissions sync issue. I didn't argue. I just watched, and I logged everything. Because while they were working around me, I was already working my way through them. A week later, a new name appeared in the system. Vertex Data Group. There was no prior record of them, no contract documentation I could find, just invoices, clean, processed, and paid. I looked up the address listed on their website. It was a shipping mailbox at a strip mall near Colorado Springs. At first, I thought it was just laziness, sloppy record keeping, until I checked the domain registration. The website had been created just 4 days before the first invoice was paid. The billing contact was an encrypted email address, but it was linked through a string of unwashed metadata to a LinkedIn profile belonging to a Michael Vance, the cousin of David Miller, our CFO. That was the moment my curiosity turned into caution. The next morning, Greg summoned me to his office. That was unusual. Most of our conversations were just nods in the hallway or curt emails. He smiled too much that day. He asked if I would be interested in reskilling into a support advisory role, something more aligned with evolving tech stacks. I asked what would happen to my current responsibilities. "We're decentralizing," he said. That's when I knew. I wasn't being moved. I was being removed. So I smiled, told him I'd think about it, and went home that night to start building a mirror of the infrastructure they thought only existed within those 12 floors. Every backup protocol, every change log, every vendor registration. They thought I was just a database architect. What they never understood was that I had quietly become the system itself. I remember one Monday morning about a year ago. I came in early, as usual, before the coffee machine had even warmed up. The system was down. Not a catastrophic failure, just sluggish. The cloud sync had misfired, and the internal calendar was off by 2 hours, messing with timestamps across the board. No one else noticed, but I did. I traced the problem to a temporary permissions loop, likely created to expedite a payment gateway test. It was a backdoor that had been left open. It had been used 4 times, each time to modify vendor routing for specific transactions. I patched the hole, documented it, logged the access, and continued to watch. I didn't alert anyone, not yet, because sometimes the best way to expose a leak is to let it run, just for a little while. In meetings, I became less visible. Greg would talk over me. David would ignore my direct questions. Sarah from HR would smile at me like I was a retiree already halfway out the door. Even the younger analysts, the ones I had mentored, stopped coming to me with questions. I watched as they were pulled into closed-door meetings with Greg and David. And still, I said nothing. Not because I was weak, but because they weren't ready to know what I knew. It's strange, looking back, how the slow fade feels worse than the sudden cut. The day they fired me wasn't the day I felt betrayed. That had happened months earlier, but I let them do it. I let them think I was slow, outdated, and replaceable. I let them turn me into the office ghost. I let them dig their own hole, because while they were planning my exit, I was planning something else entirely, a quiet reckoning, not for revenge, not even for justice, for clarity. And now, sitting in my home office with a drive full of shadows and a head full of timestamps, I finally understood the one thing that had been missing all those years. They thought no one was watching. They forgot that the quiet man in the corner had built the very room they were stealing from. Sometimes things don't unravel because you pull hard, but because one loose thread decides to shift on its own. For me, that happened late one Thursday afternoon. I remember the golden light slanting low through the blinds of the fourth-floor server annex. It was that time of day when the building quiets down, when the flood of emails slows to a trickle, and the chatter on the company messenger turns to jokes and dinner plans. Most of the office had cleared out early for some department happy hour. I stayed behind. I always did. Not because I had nowhere else to be, but because it was in those silent, empty hours that the system spoke the loudest. I was running a routine maintenance scan on the archive server. Nothing exciting, just checking integrity logs and watching for redundancy errors. 99% of the time, it was mindless work. But that day, something blinked. A set of vendor invoices didn't reconcile. It wasn't the amounts. They were consistent, too consistent. Perfect rounded numbers. No variations, no late adjustments. That's what caught my eye. I opened the entries. The vendor was listed as Synergy Consulting, LLC. I frowned. I'd never heard of them. They weren't on our preferred vendor list, not in the legacy records, and not in the post-acquisition contracts folder, which I had personally maintained until the month before. Curious, I checked the earliest entry. It dated back 12 months, a $6,200 payment labeled Infrastructure Optimization Phase 1. I pulled up the corresponding project ID. It didn't exist. The next invoice was for $7,800, then $9,100. Each month, the amount was a little higher, and each entry was more vague. Performance enhancements, license streamlining, network efficiency consultation. They were meaningless phrases designed to sail through automatic approvals. I opened a new spreadsheet and began logging them manually. 17 payments, all in a perfect rhythm. The increases were subtle, never enough to raise flags. Each one was approved by a junior finance officer in David Miller's department. I checked the domain registration for Synergy Consulting. It had been registered 13 months ago. The business address was a UPS drop box on the south side of Aurora. I leaned back in my chair, the leather sighing under my weight. There it was, the first cut in the thread. The next step wasn't technical, it was behavioral. I started watching people. David, the CFO, had never been particularly friendly, but lately he'd been jumpier, less visible. Meetings he used to attend in person were now video calls, even when he was in the building. His assistant, a soft-spoken woman named Megan, suddenly changed her schedule twice in 1 week and canceled 2 recurring finance syncs. It was odd. I also noticed Greg, my former boss, spending more time in David's office than usual. There were no notes on the calendar, no scheduled meetings, just quick check-ins. But what sealed it for me was what Greg didn't do. He didn't announce the Synergy Consulting Initiative. At Apex, every time we onboarded a new vendor, even a janitorial service, there was a company-wide message, a welcome blurb, some fluffy language about partnership. But for Synergy Consulting? Not a word. That's when I knew this wasn't just questionable spending. This was intentional obfuscation. I dug deeper. Each Synergy invoice had a routing path that looped through a shadow approval group I'd never seen before. Finex 42. It was buried under layers of renamed folders. But once I cracked it open, I saw other vendors following the same pattern. Pinnacle Tech Services, Orion Strategic Solutions, Vertex Data Group. Different names, same rhythm, same template, same addresses, UPS boxes, all registered with anonymous LLC filings in Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada. Every one of them was connected to someone in David's extended family. Cousins, in-laws, even a golfing buddy he'd tagged in a vacation post from 2019. The fraud was elegant. None of it was technically false. The services were billed, and the accounts were paid. But the services were grossly inflated, partially redundant, or in several cases, never actually delivered. And they had been getting away with it for over 3 years because no one was watching, except me. By now, I was fired. My access, or most of it, was revoked. But the old logs I'd mirrored, the retention files, the audit trails, those were mine. Not illegally. Not a single byte had been taken in violation of policy. Every record was part of the forensic backup project I'd implemented 5 years prior at the request of the board's compliance team. They had signed off on it. They had forgotten. I had not. I opened the red drive, the one I hadn't touched in 18 months. Inside were layers of proof. Logins, IP trails, PDF invoices with untouched metadata, and financials with time-stamped approvals automated through backdoor routing rules I hadn't written. I remember sitting there, my hands still, the cursor blinking, the name Synergy highlighted on the screen. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused, a kind of clarity I hadn't had in years. The next day, Laura noticed. "You're different," she said as we sat on the porch with our coffee. "Am I?" "You're calm, but not in your usual way." I stared at the pine trees across the yard. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "the thing you've been quietly preparing for shows up exactly when it's supposed to." She didn't press. She never did. That evening I called an old friend. John Carter had been the company's external auditor 10 years ago. We'd worked late nights together, cleaning up a compliance nightmare left by the previous CFO. He'd since moved on to a bigger firm and was semi-retired, but he still answered my calls. He picked up on the second ring. "John, it's time," I said simply. He paused. "You're talking about the thing you hinted at back in 22? "Worse." "Tell me what you've got." "I'd rather show you." "Tomorrow, private, I know a spot." That meeting and what followed would eventually become part of a sealed affidavit. But that night, all I did was prepare. I laid everything out chronologically, cleanly, irrefutably. I built the kind of report I knew even the most cautious board member couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the pattern, the creation of shell vendors, the modification of approval workflows, the rerouting of legitimate expenses to inflated fronts, the protection of these vendors through silent restructuring, the removal of oversight, starting with me. But here's what they didn't understand. You can replace a title. You can revoke an account, but you can't erase institutional memory. And I was memory. I had documented everything, not because I was paranoid, but because I believed someone had to care. And if no one else would, I would be the last line of defense. That night, as I shut down my system, I thought about Emily. She was 26 now, a research analyst, sharp and independent. I hadn't told her I'd been fired yet. I didn't want her to worry. But when the truth came out, and it would, I wanted her to know something. That when it mattered most, I didn't stay silent. Fraud is rarely loud. It doesn't wear a mask or sneak in through a window. It walks in through the front door, wearing a tie and a wedding ring. The day after I met with John Carter, I sat in my home office with a thermos of lukewarm coffee, my brass compass resting on the desk beside me, pointing nowhere useful. I didn't need directions anymore. I knew exactly where I was going. I opened the Synergy folder and began digging deeper into the ownership records. Most people think shell companies are complex webs spun by hackers and offshore criminals. That's what the movies tell us. But in reality, they're astonishingly mundane. A quick look at Synergy's incorporation records showed it was registered in Delaware. No surprise there. Delaware is a breeding ground for corporate anonymity. But what caught my attention was a single line buried in the original articles of organization. Registered Agent M.P. Vance. That name, I'd seen it before. 18 months earlier, during an internal presentation from the finance department, a slide briefly displayed the full name of our CFO, David Miller Vance. At the time, I dismissed the hyphenation as a clerical inconsistency. But now I searched again. David Miller, according to his old LinkedIn profile, had a sister named Patricia Vance. And Patricia had a husband, Michael P. Vance, M.P. Vance, the registered agent, the signature on every vendor file. I froze the screen, my eyes fixed on that name. They weren't just stealing. They were stealing together. This wasn't one man gaming the system. This was a network run by family, protected by silence, and shielded by corporate structure. I pulled out a notebook and started sketching the connections. Synergy Consulting, owned by M.P. Vance, brother-in-law to David Miller. Pinnacle Tech, registered to a Shell holding group in Wyoming, run by Patricia Vance. Orion Strategic LLC, with an address linked to a cabin rental business owned by a cousin of Patricia. It was like pulling at weeds and finding the entire root system buried just beneath your feet. Each company billed Apex for consulting, digital analysis, and efficiency reporting. Each used similar language. Each increased its invoices over time, carefully and slowly. Never enough to catch automated audits, but enough to drain thousands of dollars per month. The trail led to one final name, Riverstone Digital Partners. It had shown up only twice in the logs, for small amounts, $2,500 and $4,100, but the metadata told a different story. The remittance email, automatically generated and stored on our finance server, was CC'd to an address ending in ebrightstrategy.consulting. That domain was registered by someone named Logan Gregory. Greg, as in my former boss. I triple-checked. It wasn't his direct email, but the recovery contact listed for the domain was his work number. The pieces clicked into place like a safe opening. David wasn't working alone. Greg had been looped in, and now I understood the whole plan. They didn't just want me gone because I was legacy or inefficient. They wanted me gone because I knew too much, or rather because I knew where to look. Their first mistake was underestimating how much I had already seen. Their second was not cutting me off fast enough, but their worst mistake, they thought I wanted my job back. They thought this was still about me. I stared at my screen for a long time. I thought about how many holiday weekends I'd skipped to finish server migrations, how I once fixed a critical outage from a hospital bed while waiting for a minor procedure, how I'd trained the very people who were now forwarding emails to cover their tracks. I thought about Emily, how she once asked me at 13 why I didn't get mad at work like other dads. I'd smiled at the time and told her that anger wasn't useful in my line of work. It wasn't, but clarity was, and I had never been clearer. I spent the next 3 days assembling the master file, every payment, every approval trail, every ownership link. I included screenshots, metadata, routing logs, and a timeline of role changes across IT and finance. I built a visual, node-based map of the entire Vance Miller web. Nothing was speculative, no assumptions, just hard links. I even included a breakdown of how Apex had paid nearly $3.9 million in inflated consulting fees over 30 months, most of it going to addresses tied to relatives of a single executive. On page 27 of my report, I included a quote from David Miller at the last company town hall. "Transparency is the foundation of resilience." I highlighted it in yellow. Let the board see the irony. But I wasn't done. I drafted a controlled leak, an anonymous email, constructed with care, addressed to Greg, CC'd to David and the finance director, but blind copied to no one. The subject line read, "Discrepancy in vendor onboarding. Immediate attention required." The body included vague references to multiple vendor overlaps, billing inconsistencies, and a pending inquiry from compliance review. It was bait, and within 3 hours it worked. Greg called twice. I didn't pick up. David emailed directly from his personal Gmail, asking what I believed I had discovered and if we could clarify privately. I responded with 5 words. "I've only begun organizing files." Silence. Then the real call came. Not from them, but from Sarah in HR. She sounded shaken. "Mark, I was told to remind you about the NDA you signed." "I didn't sign anything," I said calmly. "Well, your severance package. I was let go without warning. You're welcome to send me an agreement, but I'm not obligated to sign it. I'd advise caution." I hung up. That night, I received a message from Megan, the CFO's assistant. She had always been polite to me, even brought me coffee once when I was working late during a blackout. Now her text read, "They're panicking. I saw Greg slam a door. Something's coming. Be safe." I didn't reply. Instead, I encrypted 3 copies of the full report. One to my secure drive, one to John Carter, and one printed hard copy, sealed in an envelope addressed to James Peterson, the head of Apex's audit committee. He was an old-school executive I'd worked with during the 2017 data compliance overhaul, a man with no tolerance for excuses. I knew he'd read every single page. The morning I dropped the envelope into the express courier box, I felt something shift. It wasn't victory, not yet. It was something closer to momentum. That afternoon, Laura found me in the garage, standing over the workbench, staring at nothing. She leaned against the doorway. "You look like you're waiting for something." I nodded. "I am." "Still don't want to burn it all down?" I looked at her and smiled slightly. "No, I want them to burn it themselves." It started with a subject line. No threats, no accusations, just a whisper in a hallway full of closed doors. Subject: financial irregularities. Internal inquiry suggested. It was sent at precisely 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday from a forgotten internal address, one I had created years ago for phishing simulations. Sys alerts, apexinternal.net. Technically, it wasn't part of any distribution list, making it invisible to most filters. But it was authenticated and routed through an internal-looking subdomain, just enough to look real to those not paying attention, and terrifyingly real to those who were. The message was brief and clinical. Recurring vendor discrepancies discovered in digital financial archives. Timeline and routing indicate a pattern consistent with deliberate inflation. Recommend immediate audit to prevent external exposure. No attachments, no full names. But I included one very deliberate breadcrumb. Invoice Jerk 728133. Synergy Consulting, May 17th. It was enough to show I knew, but not enough for them to know how much. At 9:41 a.m., my phone rang. It was Greg. I let it go to voicemail. Mark, we need to talk. I don't know what this is, but let's not escalate. Call me, please. At 9:52, a second call, this time from David. I didn't answer. At 10:10, I received an email from Sarah in HR, the one who couldn't look me in the eye on my last day. We've been made aware of communication that may breach your separation terms. Please refrain from contacting current employees, and remember your signed confidentiality clauses. Except I hadn't signed anything. Not a release, not an NDA, not even the severance terms. They had rushed to email me the night they kicked me out. I clicked reply, then paused. No, not yet. They were expecting panic. What they weren't expecting was patience. At noon, I drove to my bank in downtown Denver and opened the safe deposit box I'd rented under my grandfather's name 2 years earlier. A precaution I never expected to use. Inside was an older backup, raw logs, original policy sign-offs, and a hand-signed copy of the off-site data retention memo, signed by the then Chief Compliance Officer, now retired. Tucked inside was a flash drive labeled in my handwriting, Contingency Level 3. This drive held the logs that proved David had personally requested changes to the vendor routing tables starting exactly 2 weeks before Synergy's first invoice. He'd used an old admin credential, one that was supposed to have expired. He'd never revoked it. Sloppy, desperate, and now documented. That night I received a message from Chris, one of the junior analysts I'd trained. They're scrambling. Emergency meetings. Everyone's scared. What's going on? I typed one line in reply. Don't get involved. Just watch. Thursday morning, I made a pot of black coffee and sat down at my desk. This time, I wasn't reviewing logs. I was building a timeline, day by day, action by action, invoice by invoice. I matched vendor payments with calendar changes, budget increases with meeting notes, and then I found it. In an archived project folder labeled Digital Evolution Strategy, there was a proposal slide deck created by Greg outlining external modernization partners. One slide included a consulting firm, Riverstone Digital Partners, the same name connected to the burner domain I had traced to Greg's work phone. But more damningly, the next slide showed a proposed security realignment, listing key roles to be phased out for cloud-native compliance. My name was there, under a column labeled Legacy Resource Scheduled Decommission. They hadn't just fired me. They had planned it step by step as part of a cover-up. By 2 p.m., I had everything I needed. I could have sent the report then. I could have blind emailed the board, called a reporter, or walked into the building with a file folder in each hand. But that would have made it personal. And this wasn't about personal. This was about a system breaking itself. So instead, I scheduled an email for 8 a.m. Friday. It would go out to every member of Apex's board of directors, including James Peterson. The email would contain a 36-page PDF titled Audit Trail Executive Vendor Fraud. It included a visual map of the financial links between David's family and the shell companies, IP logs, and access history tied to Greg's credentials, and a final page listing recommended external agencies for escalation: the IRS, the SEC, and the DOJ. At the bottom was a single line: Sent per Data Protection Policy, Stoctor 406B, subsection 8. Fraud reporting by former authorized staff. That night, Laura came into the office and leaned on the doorway watching me. "You're ready?" "I am." "Want to talk about it?" "No." She crossed her arms. "Do you feel better?" I thought for a moment. I feel necessary. At 7:58 a.m. on Friday, I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the light filter through the pine trees. At 8 sharp, my scheduled email launched. I didn't check to see if it sent. I didn't refresh my inbox. I didn't wait. I just let go. At 8:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. 8:23. Another call, then a third, and a fourth. Then came the texts. "Mark, what did you do?" "Greg is locked in his office. David is calling legal. They pulled everyone into the boardroom." At 9:07 a.m., a text from Chris. "Police just arrived." I didn't smile. Not yet. Friday, 10:42 a.m. The wind shifted. It wasn't visible, not in the trees, not in the sky, but I felt it. In the way the silence suddenly became alert. In the way the phone stopped ringing and started vibrating instead. A subtle difference, but I'd lived my whole life noticing things others missed. I stepped back into the house. Laura was on a Zoom call, headphones in, nodding slowly as if the world outside was still normal. It wasn't. I walked to the office and sat down at my desk. The screen woke up instantly. No passwords, no biometrics, just readiness, as if it had been waiting. I opened a secure browser and navigated to a company test environment I'd created years ago, back when we needed a sandbox for cybersecurity simulations. Most test accounts had been decommissioned, but not mine. SES-M's Legacy. It was built into the training architecture, not visible from the main user list, and exempt from automatic lockouts. Nobody remembered it, nobody revoked it. I logged in. And just like that, I was inside again. Not as an employee, but as a ghost in the system. I didn't go through the front door. I accessed the mail server directly. From there, I scheduled a second email. This one wasn't anonymous, not subtle. It was from my name. The subject line read, "To the board, before you approve, Q3 bonuses." Read this. Delivery time, 8 a.m., Monday. No attachments this time. Just a link to a secure, external, password-protected folder containing every single file, document, log, and visual I had built over the last 11 months. I included one more thing, a 90-second screen recording showing David's credential being used to approve Synergy payments while logged into a VPN from his private ski lodge in Aspen on a day he claimed to be at a finance offsite. Then I logged out, closed the system, for good. At 12:05 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. Laura answered. She came back with a note in her hand. "He didn't give his name," she said, "just handed me this." It was handwritten, with slanted letters, the ink pressed hard into cheap stationery. "Let's talk. It doesn't have to go this way. D. David." I folded the note once, then tore it in half. At 2 p.m., news began leaking onto business forums. Someone at Apex had tipped the press. The headline was cautious at first. "Unconfirmed internal investigation underway at Apex Innovations, sources say." But within the hour, another headline appeared, "Apex CFO under scrutiny amid alleged vendor fraud." No names yet, but that wouldn't last. By 3:15 p.m., James Peterson called. I picked up this time. "Mark," he said, his voice grave, "you lit a fire." "You read the report?" "Twice." He paused. "It's worse than I imagined." "I know." "Greg is denying everything. Says it's an orchestrated smear. David isn't answering questions. We've suspended both of them indefinitely." "And the board?" He exhaled. "They want to meet with you. Officially." On Saturday, I received a FedEx envelope. Inside was a formal letter from Apex's board. We respectfully request your presence at the upcoming emergency board session, Monday at 10 a.m., to discuss your findings and proposed steps forward. Underneath, in James's handwriting, was a short note. They finally understand who they were dealing with. Sunday passed quietly. I spent most of it on the porch. Laura joined me after dinner, barefoot, with a glass of wine in her hand. "You look peaceful," she said. "Do I? You're not angry anymore." "No," I said. "I'm patient." She leaned into my shoulder. We didn't talk about the emails or the board or David. We just watched the sun go down behind the trees. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Monday, 8 a.m. The final email was sent. 10 board members, 1 secure folder, 42 exhibits. I didn't include any message this time, no explanation, they had enough. At 9:32 a.m., Chris texted, "Police are here. Greg and David are in separate rooms. Miller's cousin too. Everyone's frozen." "What did you do?" I didn't reply. Monday, 10:03 a.m. The elevator opened with a soft chime. I hadn't been on the executive floor in my entire 17 years at Apex. I never needed to be. My work lived in the basement, in rooms with humming servers, behind screens no one else cared to read. Now I stood beneath a chandelier that cost more than my annual bonus, staring at a hallway lined with framed mission statements and corporate awards I had never been a part of. A young assistant approached. She couldn't have been older than Emily. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked. I nodded. "They're waiting for you in the boardroom." Of course they were. 10 people sat around a walnut table so polished it reflected the lights above. At the far end, James Peterson gave me a quiet nod. Next to him sat the interim CEO, previously the COO, a woman named Helen Ross. I remembered helping fix her VPN once back when she was a mid-level ops manager. Now, she looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, folding her hands. "Thank you for coming." I sat, slowly, quietly. She cleared her throat. "The information you provided is staggering. The board is still processing the full scope. Forensic accountants are already reviewing the financials, but initial estimates suggest over $5.2 million were diverted." Still, I said nothing. "We've suspended David Miller, Greg Logan, and Michael Vance pending investigation. All 3 have retained counsel. Vance claims ignorance. Greg is less cooperative." I waited. James spoke next. "Mark, let me be blunt. What you did, silently, methodically, saved this company from collapse, from legal disaster, from public disgrace." He leaned forward, his voice lower. "You saw the fire coming and handed us a map while we were still playing with matches." The room fell quiet. Then Helen continued. "We'd like to offer you a newly created position, Chief Integrity Officer, executive rank, full authority to audit every department, independent budget, a direct reporting line to the board, no layers, no filters." She slid a folder towards me. Inside was the offer: salary, benefits, authority, and at the bottom, my name, spelled correctly this time. I looked at it for a moment, then closed the folder. "My conditions," I said quietly, placing my own envelope on the table. Inside were 3 pages. Full audit access, past and present, unrestricted control over vendor onboarding systems, and veto power on any technology or finance decision that crossed a certain threshold. Helen's eyebrows lifted. "This is unusual." "So was embezzling $5 million, I said. Silence. James broke it with a chuckle. You have until noon, I added, standing. I have other offers. I walked out without another word. Back down the hall, back into the elevator, back into my rhythm. At 11:47 a.m., my phone rang. They'd accepted every condition. 3 days later, I returned, not as a man crawling back, but as the man who had built the bridge they tried to blow up, and now held the blueprint for rebuilding it properly. I didn't go to my old desk, that cubicle by the junior dev, with big headphones and a monitor too wide for the partition. I didn't mind. I had a new office now. A corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the skyline. It had a locked drawer that only I had the key for, and a plaque on the door that read, Chief Integrity Officer M. Sullivan. I didn't ask for it, but someone had made it anyway. Chris visited that afternoon. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. I still can't believe it, he said. They thought you were just done. They always do, I replied. Then I added, You've got potential, Chris. Don't let them teach you to look down. He smiled faintly. I won't. Good. I handed him a flash drive. What's this? Everything I used to catch them. A clean version, annotated. Learn from it. That evening, Laura met me at the door. She looked me over and smirked. You look like you belong in a place like that. I kissed her cheek. No, I said. I just belong to myself now. I didn't attend the first round of internal interviews. That was by design. The forensic accountants, legal counsel, and external auditors had full access. I had given them the map. I didn't need to guide their every step. I had built the system. Now I let it run. Tuesday, 9:14 a.m., Helen knocked once before entering my office. They've confessed, she said simply. Which one? David, full cooperation. He's already named 6 shell companies and admitted to using family members to reroute funds. I nodded. What about Greg? She hesitated. He's denying everything. Says he was a victim of manipulation. And Vance? He fled. I raised an eyebrow. Left the country Sunday night. Private jet. But we know where he is. São Paulo. Council is working with authorities to initiate extradition. Typical. These men always plan their escape routes before they plan their damage control. Later that afternoon, I received a private message from Chris. You need to see the company messenger thread. I clicked the link. There it was. Screenshots from panicked employees, HR scrambling, legal drafting pre-written statements, department heads expressing confusion, engineers sharing encrypted folders and back channels with comments like, we always knew something felt off, and he told us 3 years ago. Mark was right. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. Denver was warm that day. The sky was unbothered by what was unfolding beneath it. Justice doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes wearing silence and leaves with respect. By Thursday, Apex Innovations had released a formal internal bulletin. Effective immediately, Mr. Mark Sullivan has assumed the role of Chief Integrity Officer, reporting directly to the Board of Directors. An independent investigation has confirmed systemic misuse of corporate funds by former executives. Legal proceedings are underway. The company expresses deep gratitude to Mr. Sullivan for his integrity, diligence, and unwavering service. No mention of whistleblower, no sensationalism, just facts. Clean, cold, professional, exactly how I wanted it. That night, Laura found me on the back porch again. You're quiet, she said. I always was. She handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me. You don't seem satisfied. I'm not here for satisfaction. Then what are you here for? I watched the shadows on the lawn stretch out and disappear into the dark. To make sure no one else has to carry what I carried alone. Friday came with consequences. David was formally indicted. Greg was arrested at his home. Vance's passport was flagged at São Paulo International. News outlets picked up the story. One headline stood out to me. Apex Data Vet quietly exposes 5.2 metric fraud. Executives fall like dominoes. I didn't read the article. I had lived it. Inside the office, things changed. Not overnight, but noticeably. People looked me in the eye again. Not out of fear, but out of something rarer. Respect. They passed me in the hall with nods, not whispers. The same engineers who once looked through me now looked to me. I didn't give speeches. I didn't host town halls. But I sent one email to the entire company, just one. Integrity is not an initiative. It's a position you hold, whether or not you're being watched. No signature, no title, just words. That weekend, I finally told Emily everything. We sat at a diner, her favorite, in the same booth we used to share when she was in middle school. She listened quietly, nodding, asking a few questions. When I finished, she said one thing. I'm proud of you, Dad. And that meant more than the new title, more than the office, more than any number in a contract. It meant I hadn't become what they were. It was Sunday morning. No alarms, no meetings, just the sound of a distant lawnmower somewhere down the block, and the soft clink of Laura stirring her tea in the next room. The house was so quiet, it felt like the air had weight. I sat by the kitchen window with a yellow legal pad, the kind I used to scribble on back in the early days, before everything went digital. Back then, paper made thoughts feel real, traceable, harder to delete. Laura glanced over from the living room, where she was curled up on the couch with her book. She didn't ask what I was doing. We had reached a rhythm of silence that didn't demand explanation. It had been 3 weeks since the report, 3 weeks since I returned to Apex not as the discarded technician, but as the man holding the keys. And yet, despite the boardroom offers and the headlines and the arrests, something inside me still felt unfinished, not unsettled, not bitter, just incomplete. Like the door had been closed but not locked. I flipped the legal pad open, wrote the word closure at the top, and then stared at it for 5 full minutes. That's when I knew I wasn't going to find it there, not in bullet points, not in court documents, but maybe in a final word. So I turned to my laptop, opened a new email draft, and typed slowly, not editing as I went. To Executive Team, Audit Committee, Legal Counsel. Subject, on integrity and the quiet things. I never planned to be here. I didn't spend 17 years at Apex Innovations to catch thieves, build a new title, or hold anyone accountable. I was hired to fix systems. And over time, I became part of one that stopped asking questions. I was called legacy before I was ever called necessary. I was excluded before I was ever heard. And in my silence, I saw everything. Not because I was watching, but because no one thought I could still see. People don't set out to destroy the places they build. But when those places forget who built them, the rot begins. Slowly, quietly, behind layers of process and performance reviews. You didn't just remove a man, you removed memory, context, and judgment. And because of that, the cracks widened. I don't send this as a warning. I send it as a record, so that what happened here won't be rewritten as a footnote or worse, as a disruption we overcame. You didn't overcome anything. Someone just stayed long enough to pick up the pieces you didn't see falling. That someone was me. I'll be at my desk tomorrow. Not because I want to lead, but because someone has to hold the line. Until the day I'm not needed. M. Sullivan. I didn't proofread it. I didn't style it. I just hit send. No reply came. Not that day, not the next. But that Monday morning, something shifted. In the hallway, silence. In the way the new HR director, young, ambitious, used to presenting PowerPoints on culture surveys, stopped mid-step as I passed and said, "Mr. Sullivan, I read what you sent." I nodded. "Then you know where to start." She blinked. "Start what?" "Cleaning." And I walked on. At 10:30, Chris came by. He didn't knock, just lingered at the door like he always used to when he had questions he wasn't sure how to ask. "I read it too," he said. I didn't answer. He stepped inside. "Look, I know I used to ignore the stuff you said about audit trails and log integrity and, well, honestly, I just thought you were overcautious." I finally looked up. "You weren't," he added. "You were the only one who took it seriously." I nodded. "You know what the first line of real security is?" He waited. "Boredom," I said. "Doing the tedious work that no one applauds." Chris smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'd better get used to being boring." "Start with the vendor intake policy. It hasn't been rewritten in 7 years. He nodded, took a seat, and pulled out his laptop. And just like that, I saw it. Not me, not my legacy, but continuity. Someone else picking up a weight I'd carried alone for far too long. Later that week, I sat through a compliance workshop as a silent observer. Half the staff didn't know I was in the room. A junior associate stood up and said, "I just think the integrity stuff matters more than I realized. Someone once said integrity isn't a checklist, it's a position." I recognized the phrasing. Not exact, but close enough. That was the moment I knew it had started to echo. Not as gossip, not as a legend, but as culture. Back in my office, I opened my email and stared at the inbox. Empty. Peaceful. No one was rushing to reply to what I had written. And that was fine, because I hadn't written it to provoke. I'd written it to anchor, to give the company something they could refer to long after I'd left. Not a statement, but a standard. That evening, Laura and I went out to dinner, the first time in months. Over grilled salmon and red wine, she asked, "Do you feel like it's over?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said, "but I feel like it's contained." She smiled. Contained is a good word. And I realized then that I didn't need applause or plaques or reassurances. I had Laura. I had my name back. And I had the truth, on paper, in systems, in people's minds, exactly where it belonged. Before we left the restaurant, I checked my phone. One unread message from Helen. Just one sentence. That was the best resignation letter that never was. I didn't reply. I just locked the screen and walked back out into the night, no louder than I'd ever been, but no longer invisible. 6 months passed. The skyline outside my office remained the same, that same steel gray wash across the horizon of downtown Denver, but the air had changed. Inside Apex Innovations, people walked differently now. The hush in the elevators wasn't fear anymore. It was respect. Not for me exactly, but for the rules, for the silence, for the system. We'd gone from reaction to reflection. It took arrests, indictments, and losses, yes, but it also took someone who refused to look away. And when the storm passed, people started seeing again. On the glass wall outside my office, someone had mounted a plaque. I didn't ask who. It simply read, "Integrity isn't a policy, it's a position. No attribution, no signature." I walked past it every morning without stopping, but in my mind I always nodded. They tried to give me the company. Not in those words, of course. James is retiring, Helen said one Thursday. The board wants to offer you the chair. She was standing in my office holding a manila folder like it mattered. It didn't, not to me. I'm not here to rise, I said simply. She waited as if I might reconsider, as if I needed time to calculate, but I already had, for years. I wasn't here to climb. I was here to guard. Some men are bridges, others are gatekeepers, and I'd already made peace with who I was. Instead, I recommended two names for succession: Chris for systems oversight, and a woman from compliance who, months ago, had dared to challenge a vendor approval no one else questioned. Helen blinked. She's 29. I looked at her. So was I when you first hired me. To her credit, she said nothing more. Maybe because she saw it too. The future wasn't about how long you stayed anymore. It was about what you noticed while you were there. In those final weeks before stepping back, I did something no one expected. I taught twice a week in the basement conference room, the one no one ever used because it smelled faintly of wet carpet. I held a private seminar called System Integrity and the Human Factor. No slides, no formal invites, no HR memo. Just a short note on the internal server. If you've ever wondered why the quiet guy still comes in early, bring coffee and questions. Wednesday, 7:30 a.m., lower B. At first, only Chris showed up. Then Jessica from marketing. Then an intern from DevOps. By the 6th week, we ran out of chairs. I never mentioned the scandal, never named names, but I walked them through how it happened, how looking the other way becomes the default, how just this once becomes that's how it's done, and how one day you wake up and realize you no longer work for a company. You've become a machine part inside a lie, and the only way back is to tell the truth, even if it costs you everything. One morning after a session, I found a folded sheet of paper on my desk. No name, no initials. Just a line written in sharp, upright strokes. I voted to remove you. I was wrong. That was all. But I read it 5 times. Not because I needed the apology, but because it meant someone had stepped outside their armor. And that mattered, more than any board title ever could. At home, things were gentler. Laura had planted tomatoes again, said it was for the grounding. We no longer needed to talk about Apex over dinner. The weight had shifted. But one evening, as we sat on the porch, watching fireflies blink across the lawn, she asked, "Do you ever wish you just left?" I thought for a moment. "Every day," I said. Then after a beat, "And I'm glad I didn't." She smiled and reached for my hand. My final official day came on a Wednesday. I didn't make an announcement. I just emptied my desk into a small leather bag I'd had since 1987, left the cactus for Chris, and placed my badge on the desk like a bookmark in a chapter I no longer needed to finish. Before leaving, I walked through the building one last time, not as a farewell, but as a reminder, to myself, to the space, that I had been here, that I had held the line. In the lobby, the new receptionist, a young guy named Andre who always wore bow ties, waved at me. "I read your seminars on the archive," he said. "I think you're kind of a legend." I smiled. "Legends are people we forget to check on," I said. "I'm just a guy who stayed long enough to finish what he started." Outside, the wind was sharp but honest. I walked instead of calling a cab. Let the cold bite. It made me feel clean. As I passed the old Apex warehouse, now a cafe called the Blue Server, I paused. The original outline of Apex's logo still faintly clung to the brick like a scar. That's when it hit me. Some things vanish, some things fade, and some things stay buried until someone looks hard enough. When I got home, Laura was waiting. She had 2 glasses of bourbon and something wrapped in linen. "I found this in the attic," she said. It was my old compass, the one my father gave me when I left for college, still scratched, still dented, still pointing true. "Doesn't matter if it's right," I said, smiling. "As long as it reminds you what right used to feel like." That night I stood out back. The sky was clear, the air still. My phone buzzed, a message from Chris. The new hire asked what makes a system truly secure. I said, "Not the code, not the policy, the guy who never looked away." I didn't reply. I just looked up at the stars. Quiet, unfailing, beyond edit or committee. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel forgotten. Not because anyone remembered me, but because I had left something behind. A bridge, a line in the code, a silence that would echo long after my footsteps disappeared from that hallway floor. Has this story stayed with you? Have you ever felt erased, yet walked away with your head held high? Leave a comment below. Like this video if you've ever built something in silence. Subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, invisible injustice, and the kind of revenge no one sees coming, but everyone feels. Because in the end, not all revenge needs to be loud. Some of it is silent.